Hey, Mark, this is the first time we have been together in 2022. You've had a lot of transition.
I have. I have.
You're
We've
in
moved in. We've moved into a new house, actually,
yes.
near my
Who,
church
who
in
sang that
Linwood.
60 song? Just moved in my new house today. Moving was hard, but it got spread away. It was about the haunted house.
Twiggy. That was
No, it
Twiggy.
was not Twiggy. No, it was not. That is one artist I don't remember, but I just remember that voice. Don't you be here when the morning comes.
Yeah.
Uh,
Twiggy had a cameo in Blues Brothers, by the way, so you have to check that out. She did.
I had forgotten Twiggy, the thin
Yeah.
model.
Yeah. Yeah. No, we got a new home. We're close to our church out in Linwood, Kansas, and I'm coming to you from the new broadcast center of our home with nothing on the walls because my autographed picture of Thom Rainer hasn't arrived yet, but it'll go right behind me, and so that's where that. So you'll be looking at me in my office all the time.
Hey, can I make a recommendation about that autograph picture?
Sure.
Use a print instead of the original
Mm-hmm.
because these things get stolen because of their value.
That's true. That's true.
And,
I've had
and
three.
so,
I've had three of them stolen out of my truck before. So
so
you
keep
know.
keep the original under lock and key and go with prints on
All
there.
right.
Okay.
I will. All right. Good enough.
Hey,
No, we're ready to roll.
we're ready to roll. We're going to talk about a very serious subject, but a very needed subject, the subject of depression. And Mark, we're going to take 3 parts to do this because you'll understand the because once we get into it. It is such an important issue, an issue that used to be swept under the rug, an issue that many church leaders, pastors in particular, were ashamed to admit. And one of the things we want to do is take the shame away. We want to talk about the reality. We want to talk about some of the solutions without saying that we are the type of personnel that can solve these problems. We'll defer to the professionals there. But 2020 and 2021, well, they were difficult. But it was difficult before COVID ever came along.
Yeah, it was. And maybe with COVID, people have talked about it more, but it's nothing new, right? Absolutely nothing new.
Exactly. So we're going to have a 3-part series. The series is called When Church Leaders Fight Depression. And each of these is going to get an angle of this so that we can dive a little bit deeper. And we're really hoping that God will use this in such a way that it will be helpful, not only to those who are fighting depression, those who may fight depression in the future, and to the church members and those around pastors who may not realize how pervasive this problem is. So therein lies our goal. So part 1 is why depression is more common in church leaders today. And point number 1 is because more church leaders are willing to admit their struggles. That's essentially saying it may not be more common as we think it is. We're more heard of than we think it is. It's a both and.
It's a both and this is completely anecdotal, and it's just my opinion. I think it's a little more prevalent today. I think it's always been here for sure, but I think, and we'll talk about this later in the podcast. I think, given some of the technology and other things like that, it's made it more prevalent today. It's more common today. It's always been there. There've always been, like my great grandfather was a Southern Baptist pastor and church planter, and of course I didn't know him. He passed away long before I was born, but I've read a lot of his. He hand wrote some notes, and I've preached some of his sermon notes, which is kind of cool.
Wow.
Is that plagiarism when you preach your great grandfather's sermon notes? I just thought about that. Oh my goodness. Anyway,
well, my guess is it probably won't be caught on the internet. So
that's probably true. Anyway, I digress.
Except right now, because we just said it was.
That's right. But he was a farmer too, right? And he lived in the late 1800s and died in the very early 1900s. And so his life was much simpler and less complex. He had a few congregations to deal with. He planted some churches, but he could also go out and work in the field and work off some anxiety. And because he didn't have, and I'm getting ahead of myself, because he didn't have all the technology, he didn't have people attacking him or coming at him 24/7. So I think it's probably more prevalent today. I think there was always obviously some issues with it, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But yes, at least today, Dr. Rainer, people are willing to talk about it more and be far more open with it than they were in the past.
I totally agree. Related to that is the times have also changed because church leaders, particularly pastors, were revered for the most
Yes.
part many years ago, and they are not revered now. I do remember all of my pastorates, and even though it's been a while, the last one ended in 1994. What I do remember distinctly is how even non-believers had respect for the position, and most believers did, even when they fussed at you. There's not necessarily in culture any respect for pastors and other church leaders today.
No, there's suspect.
Yeah, that's a
If
good word.
you say you're a pastor, then you're suspect. You're either a predator or you're a charlatan, or really, it's true. I remember as a young child in the early 1960s going to grade school, and they would ask, we'd go around the class and they'd say, "What's your father do? What's your dad do?" And I'd say, "My dad's the pastor of the Baptist church." And I was proud of that. And even people who didn't go to church, even my classmates whose families maybe didn't go to church. You're right. There was a certain level of respect that went with the man who was the pastor in town. And certainly in my great grandfather's era, he was
Absolutely.
illiterate when he first became a pastor. He taught himself to read.
Hmm.
But he was one of the few people probably in his culture, in his rural group, that could read well. And so he was somewhat learned and respected in that regard. I don't know how we got on this topic. We're a little off, but
No,
but
no, 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 because of the change in attitude.
yeah, that's right. That's true. And so that has made it harder too. So yes, there's always been depression in ministry, but I do believe it's not only more talked about today. I think, given the things we've just said, it's more prevalent today.
I
It's a
totally agree.
it's a
Hey,
24-hour ministry. You can't get away from it. As you said, people don't respect the pastor the way they used to. We'll go on and talk about that some more.
we
By the
got.
way, here's one more. You ready? I got another one.
I'm
Back in
ready.
even in my dad's day, even in the 1960s and 50s, let alone my great grandfather, I mean, money was tight, but nobody had a lot of money, and you didn't have a cell phone to pay for. You didn't have internet to pay for. If you had one car, that was enough. And so you could get by on a lot less money in those days. Today, if you're a pastor, again, the financial pressures that come, you got to have your cell phone, your wife's smartphone, your kids, you got to probably have two cars, the internet in your house costs a lot. I mean, there's just so many added expenses that you
True.
didn't have a decade or 3 or 4 decades ago. That adds to the pressure as well.
Hey, going down a side trail for just a second as well. This week, I had a request for Church Answers had a request to do a possible consultation for a Greek Orthodox church. We have never done a consultation request for a Greek Orthodox church, and I ended up telling um, him that it's really not who we are. Let's find someone in your tribe that understands you, that gets you. So we had a good ending on that. But he introduced himself, though he was younger than me, as Father, and I'll make up the name, Father Jim. I'm not going to give the name, Father Jim. I can remember in St. Petersburg when I was a pastor that a lot of people call me Father Thom because of
Mm-hmm.
not the Catholic tradition that was there, but
Mm-hmm.
also because of the respect that was
Mm-hmm.
there. That
Yeah,
was that was just indicative. And Mark, you can call me Father Thom, Most Holy
I
Reverend
will.
Dr. Dane
I
Rainer if
will.
you want to.
I do. I'll just call you Big Poppy. That'll be good. Anyway, but let's get back to the subject. Yes, it's more talked about today, therefore it seems more prevalent today.
And I
And
totally agree. It's both and.
yeah,
And here's the reason why is both and. You alluded to it. Why depression is more common in church leaders today. Number two is because social media is not only prevalent, pervasive, it is toxic as well. You can find toxicity all over the place.
it is. And you just scrolling on it, you're going to find something that's going to irritate you, that's going to sort of draw you in. You're going to feel defensive about it, or you're going to become angry about it. It's just really hard not to do that. I mean, I don't have any idea how we're going to really ever pull ourselves out of this hole that we're in, where we get lost in this dark hole of social media, where we argue over everything you could
Every
imagine.
single thing. Yes.
Yeah, and argument and disagreement, it just drains you, and it takes your creativity, it takes your joy, and oftentimes, Paul told Timothy when he was writing to him in the book of First Timothy, and encouraged him to stay at Ephesus. He warned him about the folks in the church that were arguing over myths and genealogies of which there was no resolution. Basically, is what Paul is saying. We don't know what the myths and genealogies were, but it's like a Twitter fight of which there's no resolution to this. People are just arguing to be arguing, and
Yes.
taking a stand to be taking a stand, and then it becomes polarized. Well, which side are you on? You got to pick a side. So we kind of live in a culture where you got to pick a side. And if you don't want to pick a side, then someone will pick a side for you and decide what you believe. And so
And
we get
boy,
all that.
didn't the pandemic and the politics really create more sides?
Yeah, it really did. And yet, as a pastor, you really do need to be on social media. You can't just sign off, because that's where people are. That's where your culture is. That's where people learn who you are and communicate. We just did a huge Christmas celebration in Little Linwood, Kansas, and our church put it on. We had a parade. We had a big gospel concert, a bluegrass concert, a whole bunch of stuff. Point is, there's 400 people in Linwood. We had over 500 people show up.
Wow.
The only advertising we did was social media. That's it.
Wow.
We didn't do anything else. It was just social media. And so you've got to be out there on social media and know how to use it, but it is toxic at the same time.
We're doing a 3-part series, When Church Leaders Fight Depression. This is part 1, why depression is more common in churches today. Number 1, we said because church leaders are willing to admit their struggles, so it's not only more pervasive, it is more public now. 2, because social media is often toxic. And number 3, because critics are more emboldened. You get someone criticizing a pastor, a church leader on social media or in a business meeting or whatever the context may be, and someone's looking and saying, oh, it's okay, we can go after these people.
Exactly. You mentioned earlier in this podcast, in previous generations, there was a built-in esteem and respect that went with being a pastor. And we've talked about how that has long since left. And that's true even in the local church. I did a transitional interim not long ago, and we made some needed changes that the deacons wanted to make, but some of the membership was not happy about it. And I will never forget one Sunday between Sunday school and worship in the vestibule of the church, where everybody could see, this elderly gentleman puts his finger literally in my chest, not near it, but touched me and punked me and just told me I was the problem and he wasn't coming to worship until I was gone. And he raised his voice, and I was just amazed that he felt like he had the freedom on Sunday morning to just attack me that way. And everybody just stood around and looked at it. So what I did, I immediately, that after church that day, I contacted the chairman of deacons. I said, look, I'm your interim, but we got to meet tonight at 6:00 or I'm not going to be here next Sunday. And so they met at 6:00, and I said, look, this person did this to me. And you know what the response was? Yeah, he's done that to a lot of pastors, and that's just who he is. Look, a lack of church discipline, godly, loving, redemptive church discipline, has created an environment where people feel like they can just openly attack a pastor without any provocation sometimes. And you know, he didn't know me, and yet there he felt so comfortable doing that. Look, I had a full-time job. This was not my identity. But man, if I was a young pastor and I just moved to that community, moved my family, uprooted them, and was going to plant my life there, and this guy feels like he can attack me that way, and the deacons aren't going to really protect me that much, that's a problem. And I'm going to tell you, as in a role that I have of caring and loving dying churches, I hear those stories every week of pastors who are absolutely, look, you may do some stuff that's wrong, but you have a right to be respected and cared for and loved. And if they're going to criticize you, it needs to be in a kind and redemptive way, not in a hateful and spiteful way. And both you and I, Dr. Rayner, we got stories that we could tell all day long of pastors who have just been devastated by the way some people have treated them. And that's far more common today. And the more that pastors are treated that way, and the more other people see them treated that way, then the more they're going to be treated that way.
Exactly. And I know we all have our stories. I'll be quick with my story. Mine is recent, like 2021. So we're just into 2022, so it's recent. A pastor got run over by a church member. Literally got run over. He was able to dodge a bit, but they did run over his knee, and he ended up having surgery. And once again, you know, that's just who, I don't know his name, Bob is, you know. So yeah. Fingers in the chest, cars on the knee.
We are in an angry culture right now. And,
yes, we are.
And people just feel completely, and that's part of social media. It's also part of polarizing regular media. People feel free to just yell at people and say what they want, and that goes even to the pastor. And so that is definitely a reason I think it's been ratcheted up recently.
3-part series, When Church Leaders Fight Depression. This is part 1, why depression is more common in church leaders today. Point number 4, because victories, and I put those in quotation marks in the show notes, victories, that is, because victories are more elusive. The point here is Growth, if that is perceived to be a victory, was easier in churches when I was a pastor than today, because you could do a few things, and at least the cultural Christians would show up, and a few non-Christians would show up. Those victories, and that's just one example, are more elusive today than they have been.
Look, when I first started working in the early 1980s, I planted my first church then, about the same time Rick Warren. By the way, between Rick Warren and I, we've reached tens of thousands of people in those decades. I just
And I'm not going to ask for the division.
but we started about the same time. And, back in those days, we had all kinds of ways of getting people. We were still kind of on the crest of the church growth movement back then, right? Yeah. And we were reaching boomers that were in their 30s and 40s, right? And so they had some money, they had some time, they had young families. And we did some things like there's something that's called the Phones for You, and we planted some churches.
I did that one too.
With Norm Juan was his name.
Yeah, Norm, I did that one too. We got that phone book out, and we called and called.
We get the phone book out, and you call 10,000 people and ask them a particular question, and then you followed up with a direct mail piece. Then you'd have and we knew, Dr. Rayner, we knew if you call 50,000, that was the goal. You call 50,000 homes, 1/2% would actually show up that first Sunday. Yeah. So you'd have 250 people show. So like an instant church. Just do this and it would happen. And
I had forgotten all about that.
Try anything like that today. And I'm not saying the Holy Spirit was in that at all. I'm not suggesting that in the least. But you had some victories, I suppose you could talk about, and those kinds of things. And we talked too that basically post-COVID, probably 30% of your church is not going to come back. So your attendance is going to be down. And unfortunately, and if you ever followed me anywhere and listened to me anywhere, the church growth movement had some good things, but it had some carnality. And the carnality was it not probably intentional, but it created a sense of winners and losers. And winners were those churches were growing, and then the rest of us were losers. Yep, and exactly. If your church isn't growing, then you're a loser. And we look at the few people whose churches are growing. I can only be a winner like that. And what I just want to say to everybody is, you're already a winner. Your victory was won on Calvary. God already made up his mind that you are important, and so much so that he sent his son and he purchased your redemption, and you are his child, and you can't be loved any more than you are. He wouldn't love you more if you had 1,000 in church or 10 in church. And we've gotten away from that message, and we've begun to really sort of value the results of what we see as church growth. And that's been a huge, that's just where it lays. And the other side of that is, if your church does grow, there's a sense in which pride can creep in. And that can be a problem as well.
And jealousy, which becomes more critics as well.
Yeah. So the way we've defined success in ministry, let's just summarize this. The way we've defined success in ministry, or that success in ministry has become defined, I'm not sure who defined it, in terms of growth and numbers, has added to that sense of depression. Going back to my great-grandfather, nobody ever left the county they were born in, right? And so he probably had the same 30 or 40 people his whole life in that church. So the idea of growing that church was not really probably on his mind. He wasn't going to see it double or triple in size or whatever. It was the culture was more static back then. But today, with the culture not being static, being dynamic, and churches growing and declining, and neighborhoods changing and evolving, it's just a huge challenge, and that leads to, I think, some real struggles emotionally and spiritually with pastors.
You're right. On the prairie, the Ingalls family would go to church every Sunday, and it'd be the same people there. Mm-hmm. Today, or 10 years later, it'd be the same people there, same pastor.
And actually, if you watch Mayberry, if you watch Andy Griffith, when they would show up on Sunday morning, it was the same people in the same pew.
I remember the pastor. He had this melodious voice, calming voice, if you will.
Yes, he did. Yes, he did.
Yes, I do remember. Why depression is more common in church leaders today, number 5, because the leaders that are depressed are pouring out without much pouring into their lives.
Boy, isn't that the truth? And as we've said all day on this podcast, they're pouring out 24 hours a day.
Exactly.
Yesterday, I replanted a church in Kansas City a decade or more ago, and one of the first young men that we really reached was a man who had a lot of issues and difficulties, and walked through a lot of things in life. He's moved to another state now. He found me again. I wasn't hiding from him, but I'm not hard to find on social media, and so he's been texting me and calling me with some issues in his life, and so yesterday morning at 6:15, I get a text with a very urgent question. from him. He's not a member of my church or anything. And then, then again last night, around 11:30, same kind of thing. And so it's just constant. And you think, well, I need to turn my phone off. It's hard for me to
turn it
do.
on, they're going to be back.
Well, yeah, and maybe he's, it's hard to know where the boundaries are, Dr. Rayner, because they can reach you at 24 hours a day. And think, well, if I turn my phone off, what if he's got a huge crisis in his life and he can't reach me? Again, going back to my great grandfather, if they wanted to see him at, in the middle of the night, they'd have to ride a horse 6 miles to get there. I mean, you don't have to just roll over in your bed and text a phone number and hope the pastor answers. I mean, it's harder to build boundaries that protect us in this culture of social media that we're in. Does that make sense?
It does. It makes total sense. The last reason on why depression is more common in church leaders today, and once again, this is a 3-part series when church leaders fight depression. This first part is why depression is more common. Reason number 6, and this is the essence of it all, spiritual warfare is real.
Well, that is absolutely true. And, we believe the scripture's true from beginning to end. We believe everything in it. And if, we believe the virgin birth, we believe the atonement, we believe the second coming of Christ, then we need to believe what else the Bible says, which is that there are all kinds of spiritual forces around us that we can't see that are constantly at work, and that Satan is like a lion seeking whom he may devour. And I believe this with all my heart, and I hope guys and ladies are still listening. I think depression is the number one tool that Satan uses against those of us in ministry. I don't think there's a second one. I think it's mainly depression. You and I both know that a lot of our pastor friends who've fallen into moral failure, either sexual moral failure or financial moral failure, many times they were depressed before that happened.
Lost their judgment, lost their boundaries
through depression, just feeling like hopeless and helpless, and what difference does it make? And Satan used depression in them first to take them to that other place. And look, talking about vulnerability, I'm 62, just turned 62, but I was well into my 50s before I ever told anybody that I personally have battled and struggled with depression my entire life, and it's still not something you just want to get up and talk about necessarily. But man, I would never have done that in my 30s and 40s. I would have felt like it would have labeled me and hindered my ability to do things in ministry and so forth. But I reached a point in my life where I was so struggling with it, and I just didn't want to hide it anymore. I needed to be honest and transparent. I felt like people didn't really know who I was. And I remember the first time I did it, was really shared it publicly, was with a group of directors of associational missions. In our group, those are men who sort of are regional missionaries. And there were about 30 of them from a particular state. And man, so many of them came up to me and said, I struggle with that too. And I was amazed at how they just needed someone to affirm that these feelings that they're having are real and meaningful and hurtful, and are in many ways, they are spiritual warfare. And if we really believe the Bible, then we've got to believe that. And, you've got to armor up and put on the helmet of salvation. And, I like what Andy Davis says, that doesn't just protect your head. It makes you think like a Christian. And the Puritans would say you preach the gospel to yourself every day because you forget it every day. And we could do another podcast on that. But at the end of the day, you're not just fighting social media. You're not fighting cultural pressure. You're not fighting just boundaries of time. You are fighting the adversary who seeks to rob God of his glory by destroying you and his church.
Well said. Well, what a great ending to this first part, why depression is more common in church leaders today. And the entire series is when church leaders fight depression. What a great ending to this. Next time Mark and I are together, we'll be talking about a message to church members about pastors and depression. So if at all possible, get your church members to listen to this, whether you listen to it when it's first released or you listen to a recording. So get ready for part 2. We always thank you, and we want to particularly thank you in this new year for joining Revitalize and Replant. look for it at Church Answers. Look for our YouTube channel at Church Answers. Look for us on the audio channels at iTunes, Google Podcasts, Spotify. And when you go to the YouTube, like us, give a good rating and review. Same thing on these podcast channels. We do this as a labor of love, a ministry for you, and just get the word out, especially about this first podcast series. I think it's just that important. Mark, thank you for this. It's been a great, great beginning to a tough, tough subject. So thank you. And thank you, audience, for being with us, where we are growing healthy churches at Church Answers and at North American Mission Board and at Revitalize and Replant Church, Replanters, all the above together.